Alright, this video is on how to write a lab report, and we're going to be using the example of the conservation of mass lab that we just completed in terms of talking about all of the topics in a lab report. So the first thing we're going to do is put a title on our lab report, which could be as simple as the title that's actually on the lab handout. In this case, it was conservation of mass. You could call it, proving conservation of mass. You could call it the law of conservation of mass. You could call it many things, but you just basically have to put a title as to what the lab was that you completed. And you're going to want to reference your how to write a lab report format, which is located in the the resources section of your class notebook. And that gives you specifics and point values and things like that for writing a full lab report. So the title is the first thing. And when you actually write your lab report, you're going to want to kind of do what I have done, where you, and it's okay to use these headings. So you can actually write title and then put the title. You can write purpose and then actually write the purpose. Or you can just skip a line between each little section. And that will tell me that you have switched gears in your writing. So following the title comes the purpose, and the purpose of the lab should be written like this every time. It should say the purpose of this lab was to blah, blah, blah. So, you need to decide what was the purpose of this lab report, of this lab. Most of the time it's written on the paper, hint, hint. But sometimes you have to decide, what was the reasoning behind doing this lab. And it should be basically a sentence. That's all the purpose should be. It should not be lengthy. It should just be a sentence. So following the purpose, you will write basically a paragraph, which is kind of a summary of what you learned in class prior to performing this lab. So if we're using conservation of mass as our example, then one of the things you're going to write about in your intro or your background is what exactly is the law of conservation of mass, what's its definition, perhaps what's an example of the law, okay? You might also, if you use the words reactant and products, you might also want to define those. You might also want to talk about how do you know that a chemical reaction has occurred. I should say signs of a chemical reaction. Okay, so all of those things you should reference. So it should kind of be a paragraph, and it can start out like this. Prior to performing this lab, we learned about conservation of mass, reactants and products, and signs of a chemical reaction. However, from there, you should then further discuss each of those topics. So then you should state the law of conservation of mass, you should give a definition, perhaps give examples, and so on and so forth. Basically, in your intro, you should be able to give this lab report to somebody who's never taken chemistry, and they would have some idea of what you had learned prior to performing this lab based on reading just this paragraph, or maybe 2 paragraphs of information. So you want to be kind of specific in your writing. Following the intro or the background is your hypothesis. In this case, I believe you had to make a hypothesis in your pre-lab assignment. Okay, so you'll copy your hypothesis directly from your pre-lab. And remember, it should relate to the lab purpose. Okay, so make sure you keep that in mind, that your hypothesis should always relate back to what was the purpose of this lab. Following the hypothesis is a paragraph, or maybe multiple paragraphs, which is referred to as the procedure. So in this case, you're going to list all the steps that you did, every single one. It's basically a summary, and it should be something that somebody could read and then would be able to recreate the lab that you did at school, okay? So it should be pretty specific, pretty detailed, but also to the point as much as it can be. But the kicker is that the procedure has to be written in something called past tense passive voice. And so that means that you can have no personal pronouns. So that means you can't say I or we or you, okay? No. And it will also be written in past tense, which means you did this lab last week or yesterday. So all of your sentences are going to sound kind of the same, and they're going to kind of look like this. Maybe maybe you'll say the beaker was masked, okay? Or I'm trying to think of something. How about beakers were filled with water. Okay, notice was, masked, were, filled. There are no personal pronouns in either of these two sentences. They're both past tense, and in both situations, you're making the object do the work for you. You've taken yourself out of the equation, so to speak. So the procedure might be the hardest part for you to write initially because it's something you're not used to writing. You're going to describe all the steps that you did, but you're going to do so in past tense, passive voice, which can be a little bit tricky. Following the procedure, you're going to copy your data, which basically you're going to copy your data tables into your lab report straight from your handout. You're going to include units with your data, all values, and that's basically it. So the data section is very self-explanatory, very simple. Following data comes the analysis. In the analysis question, you're going to answer all the questions that were asked of you on the lab paper. So in this case, I believe there are 4 or 5 that it asks you to kind of answer and summarize. You're going to do that in the analysis section. You can just number them 1 through 5 and answer them. And then you're also going to include any percent error calculations. And we know that percent error can be calculated with this formula. Okay, so if you need that, there it is. And so you will include both the answers to the analysis questions and to your percent error calculations in the analysis section. And then the very final section of your lab report will be the conclusion. And in the conclusion, you're going to do a couple things. You're going to restate the lab's purpose. Okay, so up from the very beginning, you're going to restate why did we do this lab? Okay, what was the point of this? You're going to summarize your results. Oops, can't spell. It's an R. You're going to summarize your results. You're going to state if your hypothesis was correct or incorrect. And then finally, you're going to reference any sources of error. So if your data was not fantastic, in the conclusion, you're going to attempt to address why. And there can be several reasons for that. It could be something that you actually know happened in the lab. It could be something that maybe you think could have happened. But you're going to attempt to justify any data that is not expected in the conclusion by stating some sources of error. So this is the lab report format that we will follow for all labs in this class. And you will, if you want more information, you will reference your handout under resources in your class notebook on how to write a lab report.